Hi students, this video we're going to go through making a unit test now that we have included the xUnit framework within our project and included the test project and added it to our solution. And we also went through adding a couple other things such as the mock framework, and I believe that's about it. So we added mock and we added xUnit to be able to unit test all of the other projects inside of our solution here. The only other thing I did was inside my repository, I went ahead and made a method, for us to go ahead and test here. I want to make sure I can attack with one of my weapons inside of my database. So I essentially, whenever somebody passes me a player health and calls attack, I'm going to see whatever weapon I have equipped, and I'm going to go ahead and take the max damage divided by the min damage, or the max, essentially the average between the max and the min divided by 2 because it's the average, and then I'm going to go ahead and subtract that from a player's health. So I'm going to go ahead and write a unit test to make sure this works. And something else that I had to implement was the ability to get a weapon from the database. So essentially whenever I call get weapon, it's going to reach into the database and get whichever weapon's ID is attached that the user would like to use. So a couple of things that I'll have to do to set up my unit test here to be able to call, to be able to find out if this attack method works or not. So now that I have done that, let's go ahead and go into my test method now. So the first thing I'm going to need to do is be able to call my repository. So you can see I already did a couple things here. I have a constructor for my Diablo 2 test to be able to set up some things that I might need. I also have my test that I call attack appropriately damages the player. And then I go ahead and send it the player health. That way I can send it a couple player healths to make sure that the first test just wasn't a fluke and it just passed by happenstance. I can send it 3 or 4 with the same weapon to make sure they all, or possibly even different weapons, that I can set up multiple tests, and we'll talk about that as well. So the first thing I need to do to be able to tell it that this is a unit test is go ahead and use the theory attribute. So you can see once I included the theory attribute above the method, I'm now using my xUnit using statement at the top. Something else I can do is go ahead and to be able to call the repo, I'm going to go and say var repo, and that's going to be equal to a new Diablo 2 repository that I have here to be able to call my repository. And then I'm going to be required to give all of the parameters that's necessary to create my repository. So if you come here to my constructor of my Diablo 2 repository, it's going to require quite a few things. It's going to require the proxy that I use, which is essentially that REST service I set up. It's going to include a mapper object, which I'll pass to it. And then it's going to include the 2 repositories that I have. I'm using the repository pattern in the book and also the unit of work pattern. So I have my Diablo 2 item and my item type. And I go ahead and set them equal to null by default. In case I'm not trying to test that functionality, I cannot pass it and not have to set up that whole chain there. So since I need to get a weapon, I'm going to get it from my Diablo 2 items. So if I come back to my tests back here again, I can go ahead and pass it some of the required objects here. I can go ahead and say, so I can say new items service proxy. Or since I don't really use it or I'm not going to need it for anything, I can actually use the mock framework to mock this object since I really don't care about what it is or what it returns. So what I can do is I can say new mock of I believe it's item service proxy. Item service proxy, since it's generic, go ahead and give it a couple open and closing parentheses since it's a constructor, and then go ahead and pass it the object that exists after that's instantiated. So we can see here the next thing is the automapper implementation I use, and I can also go ahead and mock that because I really don't care about what the automapper does either right now. So I can go ahead and say a new mock of IMapper. So you can already see all of these interfaces I'm using, so it's really important to be able to set up a mock object, and to be able to do that, you need an interface attached to it. That way you can just simply pass it the interface type and it's genericized. So you might need to set up your project to be able to unit test before you can actually get started. And the next two items, one I'm going to use, but I might need to set it up first. So I can actually call null twice for now, since they are null and I can pass null, but I'm actually going to need to set up my Diablo 2 repository. So I'm going to go ahead and in my constructor, I'm going to set up a class level variable first. I'm going to say private mock repository of Diablo 2 item. I'll go ahead and call it mockdb repo. And then in my constructor, I can say mockdb repo equals new mock, like so. And then I can go ahead and pass in this object to the method. And I'll show you why I'm doing that here in a second. All right, so moving on from there, let's go ahead and say, and I went ahead and made a name for this one because I actually need to do some stuff with this. So this reaches out to the database whenever I call get weapon, and it's going to reach out to the database and it's going to get a weapon with the given ID. So I need to actually set up what I want to happen when I want get weapon called. I don't actually want it to go out to the database. I just want it to return a dummy weapon because I'm not necessarily testing the database. I'm testing this attack appropriately damages player method. I don't really care if the database works. If this method appropriately attacks the player, the database will be independent. It'll work every time. So since I'm trying to isolate this method that I'm trying to unit test here, I can go ahead and use that mockdb repo, and I can call setup on it to tell it exactly what to return whenever I call get. So we can see back in my DB repository here, whenever I call get weapon, it actually calls this repository.get the ID. So what I want to do is set up what happens when this get is called. So I'm going to go ahead and use the API for xUnit and say, whenever somebody calls get, what I want to happen, I'm going to go ahead and say, so they're calling get, and it takes in an integer. So I believe there's two overloads, one of them being an integer. So I need to pass it an integer. So what I can do is I can use the framework and say it.isAny int. And essentially what that means is it doesn't matter what integer they give you as long as it's an integer. But I do know that I want it to return a new Diablo 2 item. Then I can go ahead and give it some attributes that might come out of the database. So for the min damage equals 5, and the max damage equals, say, 13. And this gives me a way to have some more control. Instead of being random at whatever comes out of the database, I can just tell it exactly what to expect coming out of the database. That way I don't have to worry about that integration into my database. It's going to work every time, whether the database is working or not. Whether it has a connection to that database, because whenever I might check into this code, it might not have access to the database on whatever server it lives on until it actually gets deployed. So it might fail these unit tests if it doesn't have access to the database. So since it doesn't, I'm just going to go ahead and return back a dummy object here. So now that I have the repo that I'm going to call, and I've set up the repo to return back a dummy weapon, I can go ahead and call get weapon now. So I can say repo.get repo.getWeapon. And since it's a void, I don't have to pass it anything. I don't have to assign it to anything. I do have to pass it the weapon that I want from the database. And I'll just go ahead and pass 3. That doesn't really matter since I went ahead and set up that whatever integer I pass it, I still want to return back this same weapon. So now that I have the weapon set up on my repository, I'm going to go ahead and call attack. So I can go ahead and say, let me go ahead and do a few things here. This is considered what do we have here? There's actually a name for this, and it's called arrange, act, assert. And essentially what that means is I'm going to arrange all of the things I need to do at the top of my unit test. And then after I arrange everything, I can go ahead and I can act upon it. And I guess you could call this repo.getWeapon a part of the act. And then once I have acted upon it, I can go ahead and assert what I did is actually worked and passed the unit test. So the next thing I want to do after getWeapon is I'm going to say var actual equals repo.attack. And what that means is the actual value that I'm going to get back is here. And what I actually want to do is set up a few values to send into this. So I can say inline data, and the player health I'm just going to go ahead and set at 1,000. So I can go ahead and send it player health at 1,000. And then I can say var expected equals, and I can say, okay, I can see that it's 1,000, and the average between 13 and 15 is, let's say it's 18, so it should be 9. So this should be, what, 991, I believe. Once it's done, it should be equal to 991. So now what I can do is I can assert to make sure those two things are equal, and I can say assert.true, and I can say actual is equal to expected. Whoops. So I arranged it in such a way where I'm going to set up my unit test, I'm going to act upon what I want to test, and then I'm going to assert that the method works as I would expect it to work. So now that I have done that, what I can do is I can run the test. I can also debug the test if it doesn't work. So let's go ahead and run the test and see if it passes. Once you run it, it should go ahead and build your project. It should tell you how many tests you have, and then how many failed and how many passed. And you can see that I have 1 test, total test of 1, and 1 passed. So let's pass it a few different player healths here. So that's where we might not want to hard code. Let's say inline data is 1050. Inline data is, say, 2000. So a bunch of different player healths. So let's say the player health minus, what, did we say 9? And then we can run the test again. Or it might be better to split this test out into multiple tests and have one that doesn't pass, or maybe that you expect to not pass. And we go down, and you can see that I called it with 3 inline datas, and the outcome of all 3 inline datas was successful. I passed every single time. So let's see all of the other things we can assert. So I can assert that something starts with really, if you can compare it with something, there's a way to assert it. So are all conditions true? Does it contain something? So maybe it's a list or a string. Are two things equal? We already looked at true. You can see if something is a type of something, which I think is in the book, if something returns back a view result or something like that. You can assert that things are not equal, so maybe you want to make sure that attack is working and send it bad data, and make sure that it returns bad. You can make sure that a method will throw an exception, so you can see that it throws an exception down here with the throws. You'll just have to go into the xUnit documentation to figure out exactly all of the different syntax you can use to assert all of these different things here. So I hope this video helped you in understanding unit tests a little better and how to write unit tests using xUnit. And as always, make sure to reach out to me with any questions or concerns you may have, and have a good week. Thanks, guys.